Marcus Williams had always been close with his grandmother Eleanor. She was the kind of woman who remembered every birthday, every achievement, and every struggle. So when his college graduation approached, he wasn't surprised when she called to congratulate him and mentioned she'd sent something special to help with his celebration dinner. The graduation ceremony at State University was everything Marcus had dreamed of. 4 years of engineering studies, countless late nights, and working two part-time jobs had finally paid off. His parents, David and Linda Williams, beamed with pride as he walked across the stage. His younger sister Emma cheered loudly from the audience, embarrassing him in the best possible way. After the ceremony, the family gathered at Romano's, an upscale Italian restaurant downtown. It was a tradition in the Williams family to celebrate major milestones with good food and even better company. Marcus felt grateful as he looked around the table at his family's faces, knowing how much they had all sacrificed to help him reach this moment. The conversation flowed easily between stories of Marcus's childhood mishaps and his plans for his new job at Henderson Engineering Firm, which he would start in 2 weeks. His father raised his glass for what seemed like the 10th toast of the evening, and everyone laughed as his mother dabbed at her eyes with her napkin for the 100th time. It was then that Eleanor reached across the table and patted Marcus's hand with her weathered fingers. Her eyes twinkled with the same mischief he remembered from childhood visits to her house, where she'd sneak him extra cookies when his parents weren't looking. "I'm so proud of you, sweetheart," she said, her voice carrying the slight tremor that had developed over the past few years. "I hope the $1,500 I sent helped make tonight extra special. I wanted you to have something memorable for this achievement." Marcus paused, his fork halfway to his mouth, a piece of tiramisu balanced precariously on the end. He looked at his grandmother with confusion, then glanced around the table at his family members, who were all watching the exchange with interest. "Grandma," he said carefully, setting down his fork, "what $1,500? I never received any money from you." The table fell silent. Eleanor's smile faltered, and she reached for her purse, pulling out a small leather checkbook and a stack of papers held together with a rubber band. Her hands shook slightly as she flipped through what appeared to be bank statements and canceled checks. "But honey, I sent it 3 weeks ago," she said, her voice rising with concern. "I sent it to your apartment address, the one you gave me at Christmas. I have the receipt right here from the certified mail." Marcus felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. His apartment address, the one he shared with his roommate Jake Morrison, who had been acting strangely lately and had been avoiding him for the past 2 weeks. Marcus lived in a modest two-bedroom apartment near campus with Jake Morrison, someone he'd met during sophomore year. They'd gotten along well initially, bonding over their shared love of video games and their mutual struggle with organic chemistry. Jake was studying business management and always seemed to have more spending money than Marcus, despite not having a job. Over the past few months, Marcus had noticed some changes in Jake's behavior. He'd become secretive about his mail, always rushing to grab it before Marcus could see anything. There had been expensive new electronics appearing in their apartment, items Jake claimed he'd gotten great deals on, though he was always vague about where. Most concerning was Jake's sudden change in attitude toward Marcus. Where they used to hang out regularly, Jake now seemed to avoid spending time together. He'd leave the apartment when Marcus came home and would give short, clipped answers when Marcus tried to make conversation. Marcus had attributed this to the stress of final exams and graduation. But now, sitting in the restaurant with his grandmother's concerned face staring back at him, he began to piece together a much more troubling picture. "Grandma, can you show me that receipt?" Marcus asked, trying to keep his voice steady despite the anger that was beginning to build in his chest. Eleanor handed him the certified mail receipt, and Marcus's heart sank as he read his own address clearly printed on the form. The signature line showed someone had indeed signed for the package, but the signature was barely legible, just a scrawled initial that could have been anyone's. "The check was made out to you specifically," Eleanor continued, her voice growing smaller with worry. "Marcus David Williams, just like always. I would never make that kind of mistake." Marcus pulled out his phone and opened his banking app, scrolling through 3 weeks of transactions. There was no deposit for $1,500, no deposit even close to that amount. His account showed the same modest balance he'd been carefully managing, saving every penny for his transition to post-graduation life. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Jake had stolen from his grandmother. Jake had taken money meant to celebrate Marcus's achievement, money that his grandmother, living on a fixed retirement income, had saved and sent out of love and pride. Marcus excused himself from the table and stepped outside the restaurant, dialing Jake's number with shaking fingers. The phone rang 4 times before going to voicemail. He tried again, same result. Then he sent a text message. "We need to talk, now, about the money from my grandmother." The response came back within minutes. "Don't know what you're talking about." Standing in the parking lot of Romano's, with the sounds of his family's celebration continuing inside, Marcus felt a cold fury settle over him. This wasn't just about money. This was about trust, about family, about taking advantage of an elderly woman's generosity. Jake had crossed a line that Marcus never thought anyone would cross. He walked back inside, where his family was waiting with concerned expressions. His grandmother looked particularly distressed, clutching her purse to her chest as if she'd somehow failed him. "It's going to be okay, Grandma," Marcus said, forcing a reassuring smile. "I'm going to handle this." But inside, he was already planning exactly how Jake Morrison was going to pay for what he'd done. When Marcus returned to the apartment that night, Jake was nowhere to be found. His car wasn't in the parking lot, and his bedroom door was locked. Marcus sat in their shared living room, staring at the new gaming console Jake had brought home 2 weeks ago, claiming he'd won it in some online contest. He thought about his grandmother, who had probably spent weeks deciding to send that money, who had gone to the bank and carefully filled out the certified mail forms because she wanted to make sure her gift reached him safely. The thought of her disappointment and confusion made his jaw clench with rage. Marcus had always been the type to avoid confrontation, to let things slide in the interest of keeping peace. But this was different. This was theft from his family, and it was going to stop tonight. He picked up his phone and began researching exactly what legal options he had. Because Jake Morrison was about to learn that some people shouldn't be messed with. Jake didn't come home that night or the next morning. Marcus called in sick to his part-time job at the campus bookstore and spent the day gathering evidence. He photographed every expensive item in Jake's room that had appeared over the past few months, created a timeline of Jake's suspicious behavior, and made copies of all their shared apartment documentation. Then he called his grandmother and asked her to email him copies of the certified mail receipt, the canceled check from her bank, and any other documentation she had. Eleanor, despite being 78 years old, was surprisingly tech-savvy and had everything sent within an hour. The check had been deposited into an account at First National Bank 3 weeks ago. The signature on the back was clearly Jake's, though he'd attempted to make it look like Marcus's signature. It was a poor forgery that wouldn't fool anyone who looked closely. Armed with this evidence, Marcus walked into the campus police station and filed a formal complaint for mail theft and check fraud. Officer Patricia Rodriguez listened to his story with growing concern, especially when he mentioned that this involved an elderly victim. "This is a felony," Officer Rodriguez explained. "Mail theft is a federal offense, and check fraud over $500 is a state felony. Your roommate is looking at serious jail time if we can prove this." Marcus felt a grim satisfaction at hearing this. Jake had made the choice to steal from his grandmother. Now he would face the consequences. The officer took copies of all Marcus's evidence and assured him they would begin an investigation immediately. She also suggested he contact the Postal Inspection Service, since certified mail theft was within their jurisdiction. By the time Marcus returned to the apartment, Jake was finally home. He was sitting on the couch, playing the gaming console that Marcus now knew had been purchased with stolen money. Jake looked up when Marcus walked in, and for a moment, Marcus saw a flicker of guilt cross his roommate's face. "Hey man," Jake said, trying to sound casual. "Where have you been all day?" Marcus stood in the doorway, studying Jake's face carefully. "I've been filing police reports about the $1,500 you stole from my grandmother." The controller dropped from Jake's hands, and his face went completely white. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Really?" Marcus pulled out his phone and showed Jake the photo of the canceled check. "Because this is your signature on the back of my grandmother's check. The same check you signed for when it was delivered here 3 weeks ago." Jake's mouth opened and closed like a fish, no words coming out. Marcus could see the panic building in his roommate's eyes as the reality of the situation hit him. "Look, I can explain," Jake finally stammered. "I was going to pay it back. I just needed the money temporarily for something important." "Something important." Marcus's voice was deadly quiet. "What could possibly be important enough to steal from my 78-year-old grandmother?" The truth came spilling out in a rush of desperate words. Jake had gotten involved in online gambling and had run up massive debts. He'd been intercepting Marcus's mail for months, hoping for exactly this kind of opportunity. When the certified mail came, he'd forged Marcus's signature and deposited the check, planning to gradually pay it back before Marcus noticed. "I never meant for it to go this far," Jake pleaded. "I was going to tell you, I swear. I just needed more time to figure out how to fix this." Marcus looked around the apartment at all the items Jake had purchased with his gambling winnings, funded by stolen money from an elderly woman who had saved up to celebrate her grandson's graduation. The betrayal cut deeper than he'd expected. "You had 3 weeks to tell me," Marcus said. 3 weeks while my grandmother worried about whether her gift had reached me. 3 weeks while I had no idea why you were avoiding me. You made your choice, Jake. Now you get to live with the consequences." Jake broke down completely then, begging Marcus not to press charges, promising to pay back every penny, swearing he'd never do anything like this again. But Marcus was done listening to promises from someone who had already proven his word meant nothing. The next morning, Marcus woke up to find Jake's room completely empty. His roommate had packed everything and disappeared in the middle of the night, leaving behind only the gaming console and a few other items that were probably too bulky to carry. Marcus wasn't surprised. Jake was probably hoping that by running away, he could avoid the consequences of his actions. But Marcus had already set wheels in motion that Jake couldn't escape by simply changing his address. Officer Rodriguez called that afternoon with an update. They'd contacted Jake's family and discovered he'd moved back home to his parents' house in Ohio. The Postal Inspection Service was coordinating with local authorities there to serve him with federal charges. "He can run," Officer Rodriguez said, "but he can't hide from this. Mail theft and check fraud are serious crimes, and we have all the evidence we need for a conviction." Within a week, Jake Morrison was arrested at his parents' house in Cleveland. The local news even picked up the story since it involved an elderly victim and crossed state lines. Marcus watched the brief news segment with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. He'd never wanted to destroy anyone's life, but Jake had made choices that led to this moment. Marcus thought about his grandmother, who had been so excited to help celebrate his graduation, and he felt no regret about pursuing justice. The legal process moved forward steadily. Jake was extradited back to face charges in the county where the crime occurred. His parents hired a lawyer who immediately began calling Marcus, trying to negotiate some kind of plea deal that would keep their son out of prison. Marcus consulted with the district attorney's office and learned that Jake was facing up to 5 years in federal prison for mail theft and another 3 years on state charges for check fraud. The lawyer was desperate to avoid trial, knowing that the evidence against Jake was overwhelming. But Marcus wasn't interested in making deals. Jake had stolen from his grandmother, lied to his face for weeks, and then tried to run away from the consequences. Some actions deserved punishment, and this was one of them. The case never went to trial. Faced with the mountain of evidence against him and the prospect of 8 years in prison, Jake ultimately pled guilty to all charges. The judge sentenced him to 18 months in federal prison, followed by 2 years of probation and full restitution to Alina Williams. Marcus attended the sentencing hearing with his grandmother. Alina had insisted on coming, saying she wanted to look Jake in the eye and tell him how his actions had affected her. When the judge asked if she had anything to say, Alina stood up slowly and addressed Jake directly. "Young man," she said in her clear, strong voice, "I saved that money for months to celebrate my grandson's achievement. It wasn't just money to me. It was love, it was pride, it was family. You didn't just steal $1,500 from me. You stole my trust, and you stole my grandson's joy in his graduation. I hope you think about that every day you're in prison." Jake, dressed in an orange jumpsuit and handcuffs, couldn't meet her eyes. Marcus felt proud of his grandmother's dignity and strength, even in the face of such betrayal. After the hearing, as they walked out of the courthouse together, Alina took Marcus's arm and smiled up at him. "I'm proud of how you handled this, sweetheart. You stood up for what was right, even when it was difficult." Marcus squeezed her hand gently. "I learned from the best, Grandma." 6 months later, Marcus received the first restitution payment from Jake's prison work program. It was only $50, but it represented the beginning of Jake paying back what he owed. At the current rate, it would take Jake several years to fully repay the debt, but Marcus didn't mind waiting. Justice, he'd learned, wasn't always quick, but it was always worth pursuing. Marcus kept the gaming console Jake had left behind, not because he wanted it, but because it served as a reminder. Every time he looked at it, he remembered the importance of standing up for family, of refusing to let people take advantage of those he loved, and of ensuring that actions have consequences. He also started checking his mail more carefully and made sure his grandmother knew to call him directly whenever she sent anything important. Trust, once broken, required new safeguards to rebuild. The experience had changed Marcus in fundamental ways. He'd always been conflict-averse, preferring to let things slide rather than confront problems directly. But seeing his grandmother's hurt and disappointment had awakened something fierce in him, a protective instinct he hadn't known he possessed. At his new job at Henderson Engineering, Marcus quickly gained a reputation as someone who wouldn't tolerate cutting corners or unethical behavior. When a coworker tried to take credit for Marcus's design work, Marcus didn't hesitate to document everything and present the evidence to their supervisor. His colleagues began coming to him when they faced workplace injustices, knowing he would help them stand up for themselves. Marcus discovered he had a talent for organizing evidence and presenting clear, compelling cases for why certain behaviors were unacceptable. One evening, almost a year after Jake's sentencing, Marcus was having dinner with his family when his phone rang. It was Officer Rodriguez, calling with an update he thought Marcus would find interesting. "Your former roommate is being investigated for another fraud case," she said. "Apparently, he was running similar scams on other people before he targeted your family. The investigation is turning up multiple victims." Marcus wasn't surprised. People who stole from elderly grandmothers rarely limited themselves to a single crime. Jake's pattern of behavior suggested someone who had been comfortable with theft and deception for a long time. "Will this affect his sentence?" Marcus asked. "Probably. If they can prove the other cases, he'll likely face additional charges when he gets out of federal prison. He might be looking at several more years behind bars." After ending the call, Marcus shared the news with his family. His grandmother, who was visiting for Sunday dinner, listened thoughtfully and then nodded with satisfaction. "Good," she said simply. "People like that don't usually stop with just one victim. I'm glad he won't be able to hurt other families." That night, Marcus reflected on how much his life had changed since that graduation dinner 18 months ago. He'd learned that sometimes the most important battles are the ones you fight for other people, that justice often requires persistence and courage, and that standing up to bullies and thieves, even former friends, was not just right but necessary. The restitution payments from Jake continued to arrive monthly, slowly but steadily. Alina always insisted on using the money for something special, usually a family dinner or a small gift for Marcus. She said it made the whole experience feel more like justice and less like victimhood. Marcus never regretted pursuing charges against Jake Morrison. Some people might have called it harsh, sending a former friend to prison over money. But Marcus knew it wasn't really about the money. It was about protecting his family, holding people accountable for their choices, and ensuring that those who prey on the elderly face real consequences. As he sat in his apartment, now living alone and much happier for it, Marcus looked at the gaming console one last time before finally deciding to donate it to a local children's charity. He didn't need the reminder anymore. The lessons he'd learned were now part of who he was, and Jake Morrison's theft had ultimately made him a stronger, more principled person. Sometimes, Marcus thought, the best revenge is simply ensuring that justice is served, and then moving forward to build a better life. And that's exactly what he had done.